In a national forest in the eastern Sierra Nevada of California, in the spring of 2023, a set of photographs reached the state wildlife agency. They showed a compact, heavily built, dark-furred carnivore low to the ground, crossing high country snow. The animal was not large, but it was unmistakably powerful, with a broad head and a rolling gait. Biologists examined the images and the video that followed, studying the body proportions, the coloration, the way it moved, and they consulted specialists who had worked with the species elsewhere. They confirmed what it was, and in confirming it, they confirmed something stranger, which is that the animal had no business being there at all, because the species it belonged to had been considered gone from the state of California for roughly 100 years. The sighting was logged across 3 separate counties. It would have meant very little, except that it was the second time. Between 2008 and 2018, a single animal of exactly the same kind had been documented far to the north, in the Tahoe National Forest, the first of its species confirmed in California since the 1920s. It was photographed on and off for about a decade, and in all that time, it was always alone. Then, years after that northern animal was last recorded, the 2023 individual appeared in the eastern Sierra, hundreds of miles away and clearly a different animal. 2 confirmed sightings in a century, in a state where the species had been formally written off as extirpated. Neither animal belonged to any known California population. None was believed to exist. And yet, there they were, one after the other, generations apart, in a mountain range that was supposed to have none. The animal is the wolverine, Gulo gulo, the largest land-dwelling member of the weasel family, a stocky, muscular carnivore built for deep snow and hard country with a reputation for strength and endurance out of all proportion to its size. And that identification reframes the entire question. The issue is not whether the Sierra Nevada can support a wolverine. These mountains were wolverine habitat for a very long time, until the animal was wiped out of the state early in the 20th century. The issue is how a wolverine got back to them, because the nearest place these animals reliably live is not next door. It is hundreds of miles away on the far side of some of the most inhospitable ground in the American West. The plausibility of the crossing rests on 4 things. The first is the history of the place itself. The wolverine did not appear in an environment that had never known it. The High Sierra, with its snowpack that lingers deep into summer, its remoteness, and its cold, is close to ideal wolverine terrain, and the species occupied it until roughly the 1920s, when trapping and poisoning erased it from California along with much of the Mountain West. So the mountains were not a foreign land to the animal. They were a vacancy. What had to be crossed was not unsuitable habitat, but the gap between the emptied range and the nearest range still occupied, and that gap runs through the Great Basin, the vast expanse of desert and dry mountains that separates the Sierra from the Rockies. The second is the source. There are thought to be only around 300 wolverines in the entire contiguous United States, a scattered, low-density population concentrated in the northern Rocky Mountains and the North Cascades. That population is the only plausible origin for an animal turning up in California, and it matters that wolverines, particularly young males, are driven to disperse. When a young wolverine leaves the place it was born to find territory of its own, it does not settle for the next valley. It travels. The mechanism that could deliver a wolverine to California is not a mystery in the abstract. It is the ordinary restless dispersal of young animals leaving a crowded home range, pointed across a map that happens to have California at the end of it. The third is how far that dispersal can actually reach, and this is where the numbers stop the objection cold. In 2008, when the Tahoe wolverine was first documented, researchers collected hair samples from the animal, and genetic analysis indicated it had not descended from some hidden remnant California population. It had come from the Rocky Mountains, most likely Idaho, several hundred miles to the east. It had made the journey, and it is not the only member of its kind on record for such a feat. A wolverine known to researchers as M56 left the area of Wyoming in 2009 and turned up in Colorado, becoming the first wolverine confirmed in that state since 1919, after a journey of roughly 500 miles across highways, valleys, and open country. Wolverine home ranges are already measured in hundreds of square miles. A dispersing individual crossing several hundred miles of hostile terrain is not an anomaly for this animal. It is within the documented range of what a single wolverine will do. If this is the kind of case worth following to where the evidence actually settles the matter, subscribe. What comes next is the comparison that turns an impossible-sounding crossing into a documented category of event, and then the part of the story that almost everyone gets wrong, The fourth element is the barrier itself, the Great Basin, and whether a snow-adapted animal could really traverse that much dry, low, punishing ground. The answer comes from a second animal that did essentially the same thing, in the same direction, on camera. In 2011, a gray wolf known as OR7 left northeastern Oregon and walked into California, becoming the first confirmed wild wolf in the state since 1924. That animal was wearing a tracking collar, so its journey was not inferred. It was recorded step by step across more than 1,000 miles of exactly the kind of fragmented, road-cut, semi-arid country that supposedly cannot be crossed. If a wolf can be documented walking 1,000 miles into California through that landscape, a wolverine covering several hundred miles of it is not a fantasy. And the wolverine is, if anything, more suited to the task than the wolf, built specifically to move through terrain and cold and snow that stops almost everything else. A wolverine will cross a high mountain pass in the dead of winter that would turn back a person on skis, and it will do it not as a desperate exception but as a matter of routine, covering ground at a pace and over obstacles that seem to ignore the usual rules of size and stamina. The distance from the Rockies to the Sierra is immense by the standard of most animals. By the standard of a dispersing wolverine, it is merely long and hard and survivable. The barrier is real. It is simply not the wall it appears to be, and the animals that cross it leave a documented trail when anyone is equipped to notice. The skeptic's natural objection deserves a direct answer. It is that 2 confirmed animals in 100 years is so vanishingly rare that something other than natural dispersal must be involved, an escaped captive, a quiet release, a hoax dressed up as a wild event. That objection has weight, and it should not be dismissed. But it runs into the genetics of the 2008 animal, which tied it to the wild Rocky Mountain population rather than to any captive stock, and into the simple fact that the documented behavior of dispersing wolverines already accounts for exactly this kind of appearance. What cannot be produced in either case is the route. No one tracked these animals across the Great Basin. The arrival is confirmed, the path is not. And there is one part of the story that has to be surrendered plainly, because it is the part most often told wrong. The confirmation of a wolverine in California is routinely reported as the wolverine returning, as though the species has re-established itself in the Sierra. It has not. Both animals were, by every indication, lone individuals, almost certainly males, wandering far outside any breeding population. One animal, however remarkable its journey, cannot found anything by itself. The 2008 Wolverine and the 2023 Wolverine were different individuals, separated by enough years that the first is very likely no longer alive, and there is no evidence of a female, a den, or a single Wolverine born on California soil. A lone disperser is a visitor, not a recovery, and the difference is the entire point. The science does not assert that Wolverines have come back to California. It asserts something narrower and, in its way, more haunting. The Sierra Nevada remains capable of holding the species it lost a century ago. The population that could refill it sits a few hundred miles away, and the young animals of that population are built to cross exactly that distance across exactly that kind of ground, and on rare documented occasions, one of them does. 2 have been confirmed on the California side of that crossing in 100 years. How many made the attempt and were never photographed, and how many turned back or died somewhere in the basin between the ranges is not recorded anywhere. The snow that the 2023 animal crossed melted out that summer, the way Sierra snow does, and took its tracks with it. The range it walked into is still empty of its kind, still cold, still waiting, the way it has waited since the last of them was killed there, long before anyone thought to watch for the next one coming out of the east.